the idea that indoor dining is the pinnacle of human existence is that's a little bit laughable. I've held back on a laugh. I think that it is a serious concern that kids might not be able to get to school. I think that that is one of the things that I don't have children, but I found myself thinking multiple times during the pandemic that I don't know um, how parents are dealing with not being able to send their kid into school. I would say that once again, I'm forced to contend with the difference between what we wish were true versus what is true. What is true is that if we are sending our children into school, we're exposing them potentially repeatedly to COVID. Children can and do get long COVID and die of COVID-19 infection. They do spread it. They do bring it back home. They spread it to their relatives, some of whom may be vulnerable. And one of the other things that I found myself surprised at hearing is this idea that there is this group of others called vulnerable people. There is not a group of others called vulnerable people. Every time a person gets infected with a major pathogen, and it doesn't have to be COVID, let's broaden the conversation. It can be anything of enough serious consequence. Every time that makes them a little bit more vulnerable. So this idea that there is this fenced off group of people who are at risk, and then there's the rest of us who are not at risk is also quite a fiction. There is a
Director Seltzer, I'm just parroting language that I think both of you have used about the, disproportionately Black and brown people being under vaccinated in the beginning, like that. And people who are disabled in particular feeling abandoned by the idea that if most of us are probably not going to have the worst effects of COVID, then we should all take our masks off, when they have to still rely on those kinds of protections to protect themselves from very bad outcomes indeed. So I take your point, but I also think that we have to acknowledge everyone here has brought up this idea that part of what is so insidious about the social policy as it's being implemented now is that it assumes that everybody is as robust as a 24-year-old college student who is vaxxed and boosted at least once, when that's not the case. What do you say to that?
So I would say that there are two categories, right? There's the category of folks who were disabled when the pandemic began, and the impact on them has been obviously disproportionate in terms of they are still not safe to go out in public unmasked. In some spaces, they are criticized in public for doing what it takes to keep themselves safe, which I think is absurd.
Of course.
But I think that there's also the category of people who are becoming disabled by this pandemic. And that is a huge number, as we just discussed. And this idea that, well, if you're 24 and healthy, you're protected. The two spikes in onset for infection-associated chronic disease are in the late teens and the late 20s. So this idea that that only elderly people or people who are previously and obviously at risk are the ones who are affected is not correct. And the vast majority of people who are at greater risk are entirely unaware that they are at greater risk. And they will only know after they have had their first, second, or fourth bout of COVID. And the risk of long-term consequences appears to increase with each infection, contrary to what people say about infection protecting you or even being good for you.
Yeah, I want you to drill down on that point a little bit more, because I do think that was the weakest aspect of Dr. Prasad's argument, where he teed up kind of the potential aggregate consequences of getting boosters, at least in their current form, 20 more or however many more over the course of your life, against the protective benefit of the initial round of vaccines, which he says we don't know how long they last until we see kind of another spike in hospitalizations. Then, there's a kind of presumption that that's doing a lot of good work for most of the population for a long period of time. Now, I said to him, well, that's all well and good unless you're one of the people that's represented in the spike in hospitalizations and death. Oops, now we realize that people need to get boosted again. You know what I mean? But I also think that there wasn't as much of a conversation in that episode about long COVID
Mm.
And I think that there's a lot of, I mean, there's weird social pressure against almost even having a credible, being too credulous about long COVID because of the way that people who have experienced it, do talk about it from the disability community, are undermined and like kind of poo-pooed in the way that they always have been, especially women who talk about their longer term health concerns. And so what are the stats as we know them? And I want to bring you back in, Dr. Feldman, who obviously both can speak to this. What do we know? What do we know about long COVID at this point? I saw you were tweeting a recent article in the Atlantic that got into some of the particulars. What do you think that people should be more aware of that they're not?
That is an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. So, first of all, infection-associated chronic illness is nothing new. We've known about it for decades. In fact, at ME Action, we produced multiple materials at the beginning of 2020, anticipating that long COVID would be a huge problem. We have often talked to NIH and CDC. We begged them to tell people about long-term consequences of infection, and they were not very open to hearing about promoting the idea that you can be sick forever.
What did they say? What was the pushback like?
The pushback was like, just because other viral, bacterial, fungal infections have caused long-term consequences that are very similar to each other, including other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, doesn't mean that this one will.
And as data emerge that show that it was occurring, has that response changed at all?
Oh, has the response changed? Yes. I think that CDC does now have some information up about long COVID. And once it became clear that it was happening, they were responsive to a greater degree. I would give credit where it's due. However, we should have anticipated this. In fact, when I was working at Stanford, myself and another researcher were wondering what it would ever take to get more funding for these kinds of diseases, which, as you said, have been downplayed historically. And we said a pandemic. And then we're horrified with ourselves because it's the worst possible outcome, and it's exactly what happened. So the idea that long COVID was some kind of mystery or surprise is absurd. We saw it coming. We saw it coming before the pandemic started. Once the pandemic did start, we moved to create materials for people who would be getting long-term ill because myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, is an infection-associated neurological disease. It's the one that
myalgic encephalitis, is that the brain shrinkage?
Myalgic encephalomyelitis, it means inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. And so this is a really common post-infectious consequence. Multiple sclerosis is similar. It's triggered by infection and neurological and lifelong. And there's a whole class of diseases like this. So, I mean, certainly there are people coming into this field who are Columbuses. They believe they've discovered new land. However, it was always here and people live here. So it's been interesting. For people who want to know what is the nugget, the most important piece of information, if you have post-exertional malaise, which is a flare of symptoms that appears after physical or cognitive effort that was previously tolerated, you need to rest. And you need to learn the activity management strategy called pacing, because pushing yourself through those symptoms can make you worse and can either prevent recovery or limit your recovery. It has made some people who are mobile requiring mobility devices, and it has put people who required mobility devices in bed. The most severe form of the disease requires total care. 25% of people who have the diagnosis are housebound or bedbound, and the quality of life of people with ME/CFS is lower than any disease to which I'm aware it has been compared, primarily because there are no FDA-approved treatments, because there's been no funding.
Yeah, I'm listening to you talk, and I can't help but think that I think some of the inattention to this issue is bad faith actors. Some of it is the recognition or a kind of pessimistic attitude about living in a world where we don't expect that. I mean, the government won't even send us free tests anymore. How is it ever going, if it acknowledges the huge toll that something like long COVID takes on people, it's not going to provide. I mean, this is I think what's going on cognitively with people. What are they going to do? Give us sick leave? Pay us to stay home? Give us medical care? I mean, we obviously don't live in that world under the best conditions. And you can see this kind of tension, I think, building in people's minds where they don't want to even wrestle with what the consequences will be of this.
Because the consequences are like unimaginable. Absolutely. And this is what I worried about the most at the start of the pandemic, because the data that we've had, now there's all this data about long COVID because there are 18 definitions for long COVID right now. But I'm talking about the lasts for at least half a year, multiple symptoms in multiple body systems, often including that pathological response to exercise that we just described. That kind of outcome in previous studies has been shown to be from 9 to 12% of the people who catch, for example, Epstein-Barr virus. Unfortunately, the studies that looked at the other coronaviruses, the percentage of people with those kinds of long-term chronic consequences was higher, more like between a quarter and a third. And so my hope is that some people are going to continue to recover, but I don't think that 9 to 12% is unrealistic at all. And I think it may be low. So we are facing something that almost makes our brains explode, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, I projected numbers that I thought were conservative. I was delicately called alarmist. And now the numbers that are out at this point are much, much, much worse than my conservative numbers. So what I would say to your previous statement is that the two choices aren't all or nothing. We've got to stay away from those kinds of tipping points in our brains that tell us that everything is complete success or it's not worth trying.
Right, but what I'm trying to push toward is, what does an intervention look like? Because I had a panel on this show between a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, whose politics I agree with and whom I align with, who was on the more, we got to do more to help with COVID side of it. And my co-host at Rising, who I don't agree with anything about politically almost in the entire world. And I was agreeing with everything that my friend was saying out of his mouth. But at the end of the day, the question was put to them, would you want the lockdowns to continue indefinitely? And the second that the kind of pro-COVID intervention side says yes, it doesn't matter, whatever many positive things that he said, and however much I agree with him in substance, people want to have a vision of what it looks like to have the kind of interventions that actually don't treat all of the deaths that are ongoing and all of the long COVID symptoms that are ongoing as a sunk cost or an inevitability, but also don't see a world where, as you acknowledged, Director Seltzer, there are education consequences. There are societal consequences for kids indefinitely not being able to go to school and things like that. I really want to bring Dr. Feldman back into this conversation. So if you want to speak to that point or anything else that's been on your mind.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good place to tee it up. We haven't had lockdowns or anything approximating them in the US for a very long time now. And I think there are very few people left, if any, who are advocating that. It's clear that at least under the current evolutionary path of the virus, COVID is going to be here for a long time, and it's highly transmissible. So lockdown or closures or restrictions on non-essential businesses, shift to remote learning, that sort of thing, those were always seen as temporary measures meant to buy time to set up systems of public health to develop a vaccine. So I think we're at a place where we need to think about long-term solutions. Mm-hmm. And there's a few categories of what that looks like. One is about economic and social support. So that says, what do you do to help people whose health conditions are such that their working situations or their home living situations no longer work for them in this high-risk environment? We have a very poor system of helping disabled people get the economic support they need. They need to be quite impoverished and out of work for long periods of time. It's a very onerous system. That needs to be fixed. Things like the Americans with Disabilities Act need to be strengthened and also expanded to include the reality of infectious disease, including infectious disease that a household member may bring home. Another part looks like regulating transmission risk. In Hollywood, they're doing a pretty good job. They have all sorts of measures in place. They have all sorts of testing, and you can take time off if you're sick, so you don't come in and infect other people. So we need to be thinking about that, and paid sick days, and getting people healthcare. And then the last category is about improving, like I was talking about before, improving our vaccines, improving our medical treatment, and actually getting them out to people in a better way. Because we're even with the tools we have, they call them, we have the tools. The Biden administration likes to say that the tools aren't getting to the people who need it. Evusheld is for immunocompromised people. A very small fraction of those who are eligible have received it, for instance. So we need to be doing a better job there.
Yeah. So look, this is kind of what I started with. That if we're talking about a world where there's an acknowledgement, and I'm not trying to push either of you in this direction or put words in your mouth, but if 90% of the discourse, regardless of your political orientation, acknowledges that, I am hesitant to use the word lockdown because I know how it's overstated and overly broad, but business shutdowns, school shutdowns, all of that kind of thing is in the rear view mirror, at least unless there's another spike or, particularly virulent strain that comes down the pike. And that what we're talking about is these other kinds of interventions, building in social support so that people can actually stay home when they're sick, ventilating spaces, et cetera, then I think that there wouldn't be so much tension. But I got to say, Dr. Feldman, I still hear a lot of people, and maybe it's just squeaky wheel getting the grease, but I see a lot of people who very much think that school should be closed, who, very much were, the Supreme Court kind of took care of this and took it out of the discourse, but who would be wanting to be pro-vaccine mandate, pro-boosting mandate, those kinds of things, if it were still in play. People have office places that still require, obviously, vaccinations and such. And I want everybody, my personal view is that they should do those things, but without the arguments that we used to have about transmissibility and how you're doing this for the community. That's part of why there's so much tension out there. There are still people who are speaking in those kinds of terms that do feel kind of out of step with where a lot of the public consensus is, and which is causing a lot of people to want to move in a rightward direction. Does that feel like an accurate diagnosis to you?
No, not exactly. I would say, I think the right likes to use arguments where they create a bogeyman about, the liberals want perma lockdown, and we just, that's not practical. We just need to move on with their lives.
I don't want to name names, Dr. Feldman, but I have friends, I have real life friends, including people who listen to this podcast. They know, because they're also internet personalities who very much speak in those terms frequently. Now, again, they might not be representative, but their arguments, I think, are taken up in some ways as representative and are used to wedge people to the right. Do you disagree with those voices, or do you just not think that they're representative?
It's okay. So let's talk about January of this year. We had this huge wave of Omicron that ended up killing over 150,000 people. What should we have done in that scenario? I think we should have at least closed indoor dining at that point. I wish we would have taken measures to make indoor spaces a lot safer, so maybe you wouldn't have to do something like that. What actually happens is, in no state in the entire country were they doing those closures. In only a handful of states were they even doing mask mandates in some indoor spaces. And mask mandates have not returned even. There's a variety. You're
getting public health information about how it's cool to wear them under your nose and all that.
Like regular people out in the world have a variety of opinions, but those opinions aren't being reflected in media. So a small majority, about 55% of adults in January of this year, said schools should shift temporarily to remote in the big Omicron wave. I only know of one school district in the entire country that did that as a precautionary response, Flint, Michigan. There were a lot of schools that closed down because so many people got COVID.
Right.
And that's happening again, by the way. We're seeing that schools are beginning to threaten parents in order to try and make sure that the kids show up, even when they are sick, even with things that are highly infectious like mono. And just from where I'm standing, it looks as though that's pressure, or they'll be forced to close down or go part remote because they can't justify staying open if there are not enough butts in the seats.
Yeah, I saw you tweeted some school. I don't know if it was that same NYU story you were talking about or something else, that it said, don't let your kids stay home for things you wouldn't have stayed home for, and listed a bunch of things that included lice. I was like, oh, Are we coming into work with lice now?
Apparently. And it was, that was not the only post that I saw that was like that. There was another one very similar. So that tells me that the teachers and administrators are feeling pressure from outside, that they won't be able to stay open. There are a couple of things, though. I wanted to echo what Justin said regarding actually public consensus was 55%, a small majority saying, yes, let's close schools. There's very similar studies on public consensus for masking. 60 some odd percent of people say if there was a wave and CDC said to, they would mask again without any trouble. Mm-hmm. Public consensus, what we're being told is public consensus, is manufactured. Mm-hmm. I think that there are a lot more people who actually care about each other and care about the elderly and children and disabled people and recognize the possibility of long-term illness. And a big story that we are all supposed to believe is that everyone is out here for themselves, and I don't buy it. The data doesn't support it.
I think I agree with you, but also, and I feel this peer pressure. I am, I was like a hyper vigilant masker, high quality, never less than a KN95. I didn't ever want to get COVID. That was my plan, because I was like, I'm too scatterbrained and ADHD to be out here with anything resembling brain fog. I need this noggin to work as a professional, and it's not going to happen to me. And eventually I succumbed, and I shouldn't phrase it that way because it's not about people's fault. But, I got COVID over the summer after taking an international flight where at some point I had to take my mask down to eat and drink. And there were other non-masked people around me who were loudly bragging about how they were the only person on their cruise who hadn't gotten COVID. Surprise, I suspect that she had gotten COVID.
Shocker.
But, I do feel like after that point, and because of all of the social pressure, frankly, to say that the pandemic is over, I've noticed that people in liberal environments in the Northeast, in, bourgeois spaces in my building, they don't mask as much. And I do feel awkward about being the person in the elevator with a mask, or getting into the Ubers and still wearing masks, and the driver saying, you don't have to mask. I mean, there is a lot of social, I know this, feels weird to say, but I feel like there's a lot of weird social pressure not to do the things that I think that people would be willing to do if they had the signaling from on high that there was still benefit to doing. Right. So.
That's the whole point. So I said this to one of my friends. I was talking about how the deaths haven't really changed. And my general impression is that the vast majority of people feel a lot of social pressure, and they will do whatever the government says is the right thing to do, because our data hasn't changed, but people's behavior has. That's the thing that kills me. We talked about Omicron being safer. It's not. It's that more people were vaccinated, so fewer people were dying. The deaths among the non-vaccinated for Omicron were very similar to the deaths from Delta. So we honestly are going to do what the government says is the right thing to do as a nation. Because
help me understand that, Dr. Seltzer, because before
we even get to that, let me just say, because not all of us are scientists, right? And you have to figure out some way of determining what's right, and that's really hard right now. So we need some government leadership.
Scientists are disagreeing. That's part of the issue.
Now. Scientists disagree about global warming. They disagree. You can always find contrarians.
This is a little bit different because studies are coming out left, right, and center. And you're right. We don't have Most people don't come from a medical background. They don't have MPHs. They aren't, like I talked to the friend I mentioned before we started recording who, does have an MPH from what is apparently now called the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And we were both history or science majors in college together. And we sit around saying, who has the bandwidth to read every story that comes out? So Dr. Feldman, you were saying earlier about the risk of myocarditis and how the risk, obviously, of getting COVID, especially compounded the more times you get it, is much higher than whatever the risks of myocarditis are in terms of having negative heart effects, cardio effects. Great. There's a study that comes out and suddenly and again, I understand these are cherry picked studies and not every study has value, but it takes you combing through because there are a whole bunch of people who are going to hear you having said that and said, well, I read a study that actually showed the risks is similar for whether or not you get it from COVID or whether or not you got it from the vaccine, which again militates in some people's minds against getting the vaccine in the first place if they think they're also low risk in these other areas. So whether or not you trust a given doctor, Dr. Prasad, everyone's a doctor. The point is that the public isn't able to parse and saying that we need to do like an appeal to authority. It's just an argument that people don't gel with anymore.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately they gel with it a little too much. And when you said everyone's a doctor, people will believe if you put doctor in front of your name that you have expertise you don't necessarily have. Doctors in economics are giving virology and public health advice,
right,
and people on Twitter buy it.
But Dr. Prasad isn't.
I'm not talking about Dr. Prasad.
But that's the thing. I mean, and again, I know that what's his face, the libertarian, who everybody loves with the curly hair, is like a pediatrician and not, again, doesn't have the expertise in this particular area. But there are plenty of epidemiologists, the people who are actually doing these studies, right? Whether or not we think it's a well-designed study, there are plenty of professionals getting studies published, including in very credible medical journals all the time, that people maybe take too broad a lesson from. But they're there. And if it's required on somebody trustworthy to filter through it all and let people know what to think. Because honestly, sitting here today, even though I'm able to spend a lot more time on this than most people, because this is actually my job, I find it to be deeply confusing.
Yeah, I think we're in a very challenging information environment, and there's a reason for that. There exist regulatory processes. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is a really good example of how there can be a process for evaluating whether a substance causes cancer, for instance, where they have to go through every study, they have to have a risk framework, they have to come to some kind of agreement, they have to publish all of their assumptions, and they're ultimately accountable. It doesn't always work well. You have some industry capture in EPA and people going over to industry, but the model is there. That model is also there for in CDC for making vaccine recommendations. There is an external vaccine advisory council. It may not be perfect, but it's much better than relying on any one random expert.
But you guys have both said that, and I've heard you talk about this elsewhere, Dr. Feldman, that there's all of this industry capturing the CDC. The CDC was taking all of these notes from big business interests and not following medical advice.
So these CDC has various scientific advisory committees. They are not the ones being listened to. The same thing is happening at the state and local level, where you have civil servants in health departments doing risk assessments, proposing policies. And what's happening, and I know because I know people working in these departments, is that the governors or the mayors are coming in and unilaterally imposing what they want the policy to be, which is usually less protective. It's usually coming about because of business pressure on them, and or they're contracting firms like McKinsey that are writing these policies with no expertise except in how to increase business profitability.
So how is the average person supposed to be parsing out? I mean, it obviously follow the CDC. What the CDC says is insufficient guidance. Like even taking this one instance of the myocarditis study. Do you know what I'm talking about? How like a couple of weeks ago, everyone was crowing about how they were validated by this new study that showed that your risk of getting myocarditis was basically even Stevens from getting COVID versus getting the COVID vaccine.
I feel like there's a study like that every week, and then you look at it and you see who did it, and you see how they did it, and I have a doctorate in epidemiology and I can assess it, but I don't know what the answer is in this information environment. There's no good answer, I don't think, at the
I
individual
have maybe
level.
an answer, which is look at who funds them. Because if you see that the funding is coming from a source more likely to support business interests than public health, then it doesn't mean that the data is wrong, but it means that it's time to be cautious in accepting that data as necessarily representing reality. I also think the whole idea of like being published in an important journal, I've heard that a couple of times, but we have to remember that the whole Wakefield thing with autism, that was published in the Lancet, one of the most respected journals of all time.
Look,
I'm
not here
tough.
arguing for credentialism. My point is exactly that. That
is that it's tough.
What I am hearing, like I am hearing, and you guys have both been very critical of these, establishment sources as well. But also there is this, we'll listen to the CDC aspect of it too. And I'm just trying to point out that I don't think that all of this confusion, I think most of this confusion actually isn't frankly in bad faith, despite there being a lot of bad faith actors trying to steer people one way or the other. And that at the end of the day, part of the credibility issue here is that there does seem to be more of an appetite for wrestling with the stuff that's coming down the pike and doing this calibration, which fundamentally I think I agree with, even if I weight variables differently than Dr. Prasad, and I don't think he sufficiently weighted long COVID and was too
flippant
about grandfathering in all of the ongoing deaths, which is a point I want to come back to talk to you about in a second, Director Seltzer. But I think that it is right to say that the approach has to be less summary than it has been, and that there's a credibility issue when people don't seem to see folks on the broad left taking into account the various variables that go into people's risk assessment versus the risks, small as they may be. There's like very little acknowledgement of there being any at all downside to a world where people are taking multiple consecutive vaccine boosters. When of course we live in a world where we have, in rare occasions, and I'm not trying to be a vaccine alarmist here, but we do live in a world where there are financial interests from pharmaceutical companies to get you to take vaccines and be on medication, and plenty of these medications that time has borne out to not be effective or to even be harmful. Do you know what I'm saying? So it does feel like if only one part of the political sphere is even taking on those kinds of questions, then they're going to be the ones that are perceived as more credible versus the half that's saying basically trust the CDC. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.